Fundamental entry number 2: Innovation. In this entry, and in the next ones, I will tell you how I have tried to embrace the word innovation in order to operationalize its use in a training and play context. But above all, I will tell you stories related to it, some drawn from reality and some drawn from other possible realities. Once upon a time in the future, there was a nomadic digital desert civilization. The continent had dried up over much of its surface, decimating the population that inhabited it in barely a century. The resulting tribal groups dispersed into the desert, retaining a federated structure among themselves. Their survival was possible thanks to a communal logic that is difficult to imagine for those of us who live in the present, well, whatever your present moment is when you read this note. This logic was largely articulated around the agricultural production that took place in artificial biospheres, a sort of giant nurseries in the shape of a translucent dome that were installed in specific points to terraform them. These points were those where the groundwater allowed the extraction of what was needed to irrigate the plants. These domes had a section exposed to sunlight and another section below ground, whose lighting came from lamps powered by solar collectors and above-ground wind technologies. Another planting came from nomadic mobile terraces that moved permanently across the surface of the desert and the sea, hunting the rains or using brackish water, which was properly treated, to function. Nevertheless, these groups retained a relatively complex social structure and a unique articulation with digital technology. It was not easy, nor did they do it in the way we might imagine with our 21st century economic structure in so-called Western societies. They did it in a very particular way that was due to the enormous difficulty these peoples had in gaining access to computing devices, which eventually came under the control of a few corporate entities, whose leaders, called emirs by themselves, were precisely those who inhabited the few existing fertile islands. And on the other hand, because many of them were in the hands of traffickers who were, in many ways, the only direct and effective suppliers of them to these desert peoples. But there was, in recent years, an even more serious situation. The planet began to cool, in a kind of arid glaciation, and life on the continental desert was no longer a long-term survival option. The Federation decided to take action by convening its 9 authorities, entities known as cultivos. They are very particular individuals who, as teenagers, were sent to live in the desert, equipped with survival gear, the best available technology, which was updated annually through the dealers, and satellite access to almost unlimited information networks, similar to those you and I enjoy today, or perhaps a little superior, but which at the time was, or will be, depending on your perspective, an absolute privilege. It is not clear whether each cultivo was about one or several people, but it is presumed the latter. The purpose of sending them to such voluntary confinement was to optimize the use of available resources. Since it was so difficult to access those resources, it was decided at the time that it would be these authorities, cultivos, who would concentrate the most advanced resources and confine themselves to prepare themselves to be the spiritual and intellectual hope for survival at the moment when it was required. If that time had not come, their lives would have been spent in lost places, far from others, rigorously preparing themselves physically and mentally for action, or training their successors if time passed and they grew old. The rest of the population of the tribal groups had access to relatively meager resources, so over the years these peoples became groups of people with a very limited view of the world, somewhat superstitious, living by the most basic daily activities and hoping that, when the time came, the cultivos would emerge to guide them to salvation. Delegates from all the peoples then sent cryptographic messages to the cultivos warning that it was time. From each shore of the desert, the cultivos were to establish a roadmap to reverse the situation, whether by transforming the structure of society, moving off the continent, or the planet, creating a new ecosystem or other technological solution, finding a way out of the human heart, transforming the environment in some way or devising a suitable machine, among other possible ways out. And there was one last detail: a requirement to be a cultivo, and a privilege was access to a very problematic word. It was a big problem to use that term. For several centuries, that odious word known today as innovation, which almost wiped out life on Earth, was banished from the language, forbidding its use. Only they, the cultivos, could understand what it was all about. Only they were authorized to use the word. But back to the present. I was wondering just now what kind of route I could set up if I were a cultivo to save my people, what I would use innovation for in that case, what I would face to make that route materialize. I have foreshadowed some answers, but I will tell you about them in another entry in this blog. It is certainly a question worth asking. What would you do if you were one of them? How would you get your people and the people of the desert out of this mess? This is precisely what a project on gamified innovation that I have been working on lately, and that is being developed within the entrepreneurship platform of the Family Compensation Fund Compenser, is all about. The story I have just told you is the basis of one of the possible narrative universes of one of the games included in this project. It has been intense months setting up an innovation system linked to the game, and a series of derived digital services. Designing this project is not easy, but it is feasible. Establishing a business model around it is difficult, but possible, and in fact it is going well. Sketching out game elements linked to the project has been equal parts fun and headache. Outlining narratives that can potentially irrigate fantasy into this system in a relatively organic way has been a big challenge, and I'd say a worthwhile one. But the really complex thing, and it is a great paradox, has been to shape the word innovation in order to have a concrete and delimited use of that term. I studied a master's degree in innovation, by the way, in case you didn't know, and it is still extremely complex for me to disambiguate it. As I mentioned to you in another post, innovation is a leprechaun mocking an endless board, but now I will tell you that it is also a strange semantic black hole, something that everyone talks about and around which they orbit circularly, something from which sparkling lights are very visible, but also something impossible to see clearly. My task is to see there, on the dark side. Although the term is massively used in our society, it is not clear that there are serious theoretical perspectives on it, beyond those that are part of the branch of economics, of which Schumpeter is a prominent representative. But it is not enough. And the academic and philosophical literature is not always helpful in unraveling its meaning, or at least in establishing the frames of reference that allow us to define it. There are indeed some identifiable frames of reference, but they do not constitute a precise corpus within which to move conceptually or a disciplinary field in which to evolve ecosystemically, but rather a cloud of associated notions, from different perspectives and with different intentions, and of rhetoric, somewhat opportunistic, that hide a substratum not yet well studied to my taste. But I will talk about my reflections on the academic definitions and existing indicators associated with innovation in another entry in this blog. Now I want to tell you what I did about it. I also, as in the story I have just told you, convened in September 2022 a group of people who could well be, in fiction, the cultivos mentioned in the previous paragraphs. On the contrary, I sought out a diverse set of people with different levels of knowledge on the subject in order to ask them some open questions, based on statements related to the project, whose answers would allow me to apply some tools of qualitative discourse analysis. This is not an academic publication, nor was this research process originally intended to be one, although it may become one, but was part of a design methodology. Therefore I will not go into the technical details of the data systematization and analysis I did in this space. This may take place in an index journal in due course. What is certain is that the results of this exploration are very interesting and, above all, extremely useful. But time is up for today. I will continue talking about those results in the next fundamental entry, which I will publish in a few weeks. I really hope I can count on you again then, so please subscribe. After all, this story may just be about saving 9 nomadic peoples from the techno-desert of the future, or some other mission in a similar narrative universe, or maybe it's about ourselves today. And it surely is. See you soon.